Hey, welcome back. It's time once again for Making a Connection, the Antaira podcast, where we take a look into the future of technology and try and figure out how to keep it all working, how to keep it all connected, I guess, with the man who works on that every day, Henry Martel. Welcome, sir.
Thank you for having me.
You work for Antaira, and Antaira does what?
Antaira manufactures industrial networking equipment.
And that sounds so simple, maybe even just kind of ordinary. But what's extraordinary is the environment you do it in. It's the most difficult environment because it might be hot, might be cold. It might be way up on a mountaintop where it's freezing cold. It might be at the bottom of the ocean. It might be up in the back of a football stadium or out in a strawberry field somewhere here. You're trying to keep stuff connected as the whole world wants everything to be connected, right?
Yeah, and we do it in harsh environments, like you said, right? That's our specialty. Harsh, dirty, dusty, wet, moldy, stinky environments.
That's you. That's
we
you guys.
make it work.
Okay. And it's got to be rugged. It's got to be reliable. I suppose it has backups. We've talked before about all the different software and different ways you monitor and keep this stuff alive and keep that simple connection going. Because in today's world, it isn't just an enterprise network. That's what I always think of. An enterprise network is like, well, here at my studio, I'm in this big building. We've got a bunch of studios and stuff here. And so we've got them all connected with Ethernet, and the different computers can talk to each other. And in a big office environment, they're all interconnected, and we're all on the same network here, and the printers and everything else. But it's more than that. Were you working at something called an operational technology network? What is the difference between an enterprise network and an OT network?
Well, there are differences. Your typical enterprise network is your business network, the campus-style network. It's usually for sharing files and folders. Entertainment, we're streaming, and even here at the campus, right? Educational purposes. Now, the industrial network is just a little different, right? We don't necessarily need to connect to the internet, but we need to provide connectivity to make sure that a sensor can connect to a module that connects to a controller somewhere.
Right.
So
specialty devices.
Specialty devices, exactly. Right. And the biggest difference is in our environments, whether it's in a tunnel, or sometimes they're in a cave, on a farm,
literally in a cave somewhere.
In a cave. We got to make sure that your connectivity works, and we got to make sure that when you use our products that you're going to get the connectivity that you're looking for.
And one of the reasons I think that's so critical is that you're dealing with critical infrastructure in many cases. If the campus Wi-Fi goes down, everybody groans, and maybe there's some inconvenience. But if the students aren't on here at UCI, or if everybody isn't connected for a moment in our office, it's not the end of the world. If I can't access my files, it might be frustrating, might seem really important at the time, but the lights don't go off. The building doesn't suddenly shut down. The factory doesn't grind to a halt. The oil well doesn't stop pumping. The wastewater doesn't shut off. You've got critical stuff that can't stop.
Yeah, it can't stop, and not only can it not stop, it also has, in some cases, it can have some major impact in different areas. Imagine a wastewater treatment facility. Suddenly that goes offline. Suddenly, the chemical, to chemical ratios are off. Now we got poison, right? Yeah. Or, imagine, a traffic signal or the traffic signaling. All the intersections.
You got crashes suddenly, yeah.
Yeah, so it's a little different than losing access to your email.
Yeah. I guess that's the point I'm making, yeah. The stakes are a little higher in these operational technology networks. So do they approach them any different, or are they still basically, I don't know, who designs these things? Are there network engineers who lay these things out and figure out how it all connects together, and it's the same whether it's a factory or an office environment?
In the beginning, yeah. In the beginning, you're going to, plan for your network. You're going to design your network. But as you're adding more and more industrial components, that's when you start bringing in specialized industrial personnel for those components. So, for instance, you might have some really brilliant, IT engineers work on enterprise. They're brilliant people. Been
how it all flows, how it's all secure, all the stuff.
Yeah. but they don't necessarily know how water treatment facility works.
No.
And they don't know how the pumps work. And you got those guys who are also really brilliant guys, and they've been in the industry for many, many years, and they don't necessarily want to be interconnected to everything. Their processes have worked, and sometimes the communication breakdown between what the IT guys want to do and what the OT guys want to do. And then in that space, that's when you kind of got to get, you set up policies, and you got to set up documentation in such a way where everything can flow easily, where there's communication and where we can make things happen, especially with, critical networks.
So the OT guys want to make the switches connect, the gadgets, the widgets, the robotic arms, the things that they need to measure, to monitor, to move stuff around, to make things happen, and to get data back. That's not just about pushing it out, trying to make something work. You're trying to get data fed back in. The IT guys would be a little higher level. They're just trying to figure out how the fiber optic flows and what happens with the data when it comes in, or.
Well, it's almost like a yin and yang, because you have the IT guys who are high-level specialists and their enterprise side, right? They know the files, they know the servers. And our operational guys, they're also at a high level. They just a high level in a different,
different discipline.
Different discipline, right? But they're both equal. I've come across brilliant people on both sides, and I can honestly say you can't really tell them apart. It's just they're disciplined and they have experience and knowledge in different areas.
But they might not speak the same language. They might be talking, yin and yang, X's and O's or something here. What I'm trying to tell you is I need this thing to connect this way, and the other guy's saying, well, but I just need to make sure that the overall internet is set up right so we can get to it, or that we can get data back. It sounds like they may not be always on the same page.
Yeah, in some cases they're not best friends.
Okay, because it's your fault it's not working, not my fault.
Well, see, that's the problem. There you go. When something goes wrong, people start pointing fingers. Well, it was working before you touched it, right?
Yeah, right.
And then now we got monitors, and we got equipment, and we got sensors, and we got connectivity points, and now things just aren't the same.
Leave my widgets alone.
Leave my widgets alone.
Well, one of the things that you brought up, we laid out some notes for this because I think this is fascinating here, is these are best practices that you've seen through how many, you've been doing this for a number of years, right?
20 plus years in the telecommunication networking industry.
All right, so you're out, you're the guy that comes in and says, where do you want this switch? And well, let me work with you and show you what it can do, and maybe even address beforehand, what do you need it to do? What are you looking at for it to do, rather than just the guy that comes in and plugs it in and leaves here? And so you're interfacing with both ends of this spectrum here, the people bringing the internet in and the people then connecting these devices to the internet, right?
Yeah, I've been in all three facets. I've been the guy that brought the internet into your location.
Right.
I've been the guy that helped set up all the racks and set up the servers and run all the networking cable and set up the cameras and the wireless. And then I've been the guy that you called when things broke to come and fix everything. So I've seen it from A to Z. I've seen a lot of stuff in between.
So these sound so obvious, and yet you tell me they're not always done. Like, let's have some documentation. Where did we put that switch? Was it in that room or this room? Where do the cables go? You would think all that's blueprints and it's all like a Bible that's stored somewhere, but the guy who did it left and he didn't mark it all down right, or I don't know where that plan is.
Yeah, that happens all the time, especially with older locations. Truck stops are notorious for that. But documentation is a critical piece of paper that that really outlines the processes and locations of devices. And a lot of times people don't seem to know where it's at, or when we're trying to troubleshoot a location, when there's something that's wrong, well, it got connected, but stuff got moved around. We've had some renovation and stuff got behind a wall, so now nobody knows where this is at, but it's failing. So
because maybe the original documentation was correct, but over time we added, we moved, we changed, and we forgot to change the plan, or we forgot where that updated plan is. So all I'm looking at is the original drawings or the original schematic, the original layout, and it may not match the reality of what's out there anymore.
Yeah, and that document might be 10 years old. And you've gone through a couple different IT guys, a couple different operational engineers, and now we kind of know where this is at, but we don't know where it connects back to. And if we're trying to extend it, we're trying to move it, we're trying to add some other component to it, we don't know. and
That must be wild. All right,
yeah.
and is it always still a piece of paper, a physical piece of paper, a drawing, or has that all gone online? And if it is, does everybody know where it is in the network?
Well, best practice policy is you have a location, a centralized documentation or location that manages all the
This
paperwork for your
file,
network.
this folder, everybody
Yeah.
knows where it is. It's not hidden under sub weird directories or something here. Yeah.
Right. And then you actually go even further and then you limit the people that have access to that.
Oh, there you go. So nobody's messing with it and changing it and forgetting to document what they did to it here.
Right. Right.
All right. So but is it always a virtual document these days, or are there still physical blueprints anymore? I don't even know when they build this stuff. Is there a roll of paper somewhere that you roll out when all else fails?
Yeah. And actually in our offices, we have both. I'm kind of old school, so I like rolling out the paper and I like walking around. I like to kind of physically see and touch everything just because I know it's been updated.
Right.
But yeah, typically when you go get, things are, especially with newer construction, you'll get a blueprint, a floor plan, whatever it's going to be, where the equipment is. Industrial networks, it's the same, but as things move and evolve, obviously you can't really update the paper unless you kind of draw new things, because people don't give you CAD files anymore. They just give you the document, or they'll send you the PDF that you kind of edit and adjust as you make changes.
And does anybody ever go back and review that to make sure the documentation is still good? This is going to sound crazy, but I got a ton of audio equipment in this room, in these studios here, and I couldn't tell you where some of the owner's manuals are. I think I know how this stuff all connects and goes together. And whatever I did when I laid it out has been added to and changed and whatnot. I would struggle. I'm sure I got the document somewhere. I'm sure I got the plan somewhere. I'm just not sure where it is, nor do I ever think to go back and see if it's still that way.
Yeah, so that's part of the policy, documentation policy for your IoT or IT best practices. You have one location that has all your documentation for maps, engineering designs, user manuals, contracts, warranties, all that good stuff.
And there is then, now we've moved into policies. It isn't just enough to write it down and store it somewhere. You've got to have some sort of internal policy that somebody looks at this once in a while and updates it and makes sure it's all accurate, right?
Yeah, and best practice says you should do it at least once a year. You don't got to go through everything through a fine-tooth comb, but at least just kind of review it, just to kind of make sure everything is still in line. And that kind of goes into the audits, right? You can go through just to kind of make sure that things are where they're supposed to be, and that you're following the documentation that's kind of been laid out for you.
Does government work differently? Do they mandate or regulate any of this differently than just a regular manufacturing facility? If I'm somehow overseeing, if a wastewater plant or a nuclear power plant, they must have higher standards to do this, or are they operating on the same trust that somebody's put this policy in place and implementing it?
No, when you're dealing with government and you're dealing with critical infrastructure, that's a whole different level of documentation and policies that you have to follow. So you got to, there's certifications that you have to go through. You have to meet certain standards. You got to go through certain audits. People are coming to check your systems. So they have to make sure that everything is followed by specific standards. Different industries have different standards. And then how you interact with the government, where if you're a government contractor, or if you're manufacturing stuff for the government, there's different policies, different security, certifications and level and attributes that you have to adhere to. And they're very strict. The government, I can say they have their guidelines, but their guidelines are strict, and they are there for a purpose, right? Wastewater treatment centers. You're kind of cutting corners on that you can cause some serious harm to a lot of people.
Right. I'm good. Well, I'm glad to know that I'm sure the people working those spaces groan and say, why can't we just do it like everybody else? But these are even more critical infrastructure. All right, so we talked about just documenting it, just having an accurate documents. We know where it is. We update the documents. We review the documents, and we have a policy to do that. What other kind of policies do you have to have in place? You must have to have emergency policies in place. What happens when it doesn't work?
Right. So emergency policies and those safety procedures are something that gets overlooked. Right. When we set up a new system, we'll test it to make sure it works. And then it's kind of off to the races. Right. We never think about it again.
No.
But what happens when something critical falls or fails? Right. So The recommended policy, and from what I've seen and experience, and the best practice methods that are out there, is that you have like an annual, emergency preparedness,
Like a fire drill.
like a fire drill, exactly.
Right.
So your critical systems go down. How long does it take to come up? What people are involved? Some people time the process. So we know that if your critical core components go offline, nobody's really panicking. Why? Because we have some policies that we've practiced, we have procedures in place, and then we know that if this goes down, we'll have it up again in a certain amount of time.
Does everybody do that, or is that just sort of a best practice that we should do? But we don't have the time to do it. We've got turnover of staff. We've got a million other things to do. We'll do that next year, next month.
Yeah, unfortunately, it's not something that gets done often. In fact, I've seen it not happen more than it does happen.
Yeah.
But the places that do see it happen, they are more efficient locations, right? Their process seems to be better. Their people seem to be nicer because they stick to these policies.
They're not freaking out when something happens, and it doesn't happen as often as it might happen somewhere else. Let's talk about training. How many people have to know how all this stuff works? Is it one guy, and that guy's on vacation this week?
Well, you know what? Some companies have that one guy, and that one guy, he kind of in charge of everything. But what I've seen, what's best practice is there's a small group of core people that are at the top, right? You might have, your CIO, you might have, department heads involved in designing some of these policies. Now, the way it should work is, you get that top down, right? You
Right.
have your people on top, and then they relay their messages, and they relay their standards to the people underneath them. And that's how the training should be, right? We have our engineering department. Engineering department should just be trained on the engineering aspects of the network. We have the operations. We have different departments that have specific people that should be trained for specific purposes. We can't ask one guy from one department who's not qualified to do something in another department. And I think that's where a lot of mishaps happen when you have Joe who's good at this, but Larry isn't around, and so
Yeah.
Joe's trying to do what Larry was supposed to do, but he doesn't. He doesn't know how.
Right.
I think that's where cross training could come in, where we might say, hey, we do need him to have this type of knowledge, or if Larry isn't here, then we have a backup, right? Then we have someone else who can come in and take his place when there's an emergency that happens.
Exactly, because otherwise we're all running around wishing Joe was here, and he's sick today, or he just quit last week, and nobody knows how the whole thing happens, and we're pulling out documents and trying to figure it out on the fly here. And operating with pieces of equipment, can one person, can you or anybody else really understand how all these switches and sensors and robotic arms and open and shut gates, and I don't know, you tell me 1,000 other things I'm not thinking of that fit into this new Internet of Things, this giant ecosystem where everything, one relies upon the other. Can anybody really master all those little pieces?
No, you can't. It's almost like asking a doctor to master the whole body, right? A surgeon, or you have a specialist. You have your ears,
Your kidney, your
kidney,
lung,
your
your lungs,
spine,
your
your
heart,
knees,
yeah.
right? You're just different portions. And it's the same thing with technology. Now, you can master the fundamentals. Hey, this is how this connects. This is how this works. But there's so many different sensors. There's so many different gauges. There's so many different specialized pieces of equipment that
Yeah.
no one person can master it all. And but that's where collaboration comes in. That's where policies come into place. Where hey, I might be the master of this technology, but let me share my experience. Let me train the people underneath me, so in case I'm not here, something does happen, they have enough information to at least get us through this mishap, this emergency that took place.
So in this world where one person can't know all the pieces of the puzzle, and even if they did really figure them out and what to do with them here, you might sort of conceptually understand this goes to here and it has these kinds of connectors and it should be doing this. Do we rely more and more on you guys, vendors, to show up and troubleshoot and explain why their sensor, their gadget, their internet switch isn't working?
Yes and no. Some companies will have us train them and say, hey, give us an overview of your switch. This is what we want to do. Can you design some type of training module to help us get these configured? And which we do. It's not a problem. That's part of our service. And then we have some companies that say, hey, you know what? That's not our job. Our job is to do X, Y, and Z. you guys are the manufacturer. If something goes wrong, we're going to call you guys. We're going to give you access to everything that you need, but help us troubleshoot because we're too busy focused on what we do best.
Right. And in a world where we're all trying to be lean and mean, I would assume that a lot of manufacturers, particularly for small pieces of equipment, somewhere along this daisy chain of interconnected things here, that one little piece, it's only as good as the weakest link, they keep saying. So that one little piece breaks somewhere, and we can't get a hold of that manufacturer because they went out of business, or they merged with somebody, or they just don't have much of a support staff. They're real great at manufacturing, they're real great at selling. Maybe they got a handful of people on the support team here, and maybe they're half a planet away and umpteen different time zones away. Is any of that complicated?
Yeah, and it's important. And it's part of the process that we're in. You know, we have we've actually helped teams troubleshoot on different continents. Right, we're logging at different times, and we've actually worked out with customers where our equipment was failing, but we knew that it wasn't necessarily our equipment; it was what it was connected to. So we've reached into their networks and adjusted stuff that. Or made recommendations for adjustments that they made, and then it brought our equipment back up.
Because that must be maddening when something's broken and there's a billion little pieces to figure out. You're going through one at a time trying to figure out, is it this, is it this, is it, maybe it's just the wire connecting them, or maybe it's the connectors between them, or maybe it's the device, or the device that's connected to the device to another device. You're trying to figure out where the point of failure is, what's not functioning. And one vendor says, "Oh, I checked mine. Mine's fine.
Yeah.
See you tomorrow. Good luck."
That happens all the time. We get a vendor that comes in and says, "Yeah, our equipment's working, but your piece of equipment isn't."
Yeah, it must be yours.
Yeah,
not mine.
It's not our stuff worked before you got here, and now it's not working, so it's your stuff.
Yeah, you plugged it in. You're the problem. You're the last one to touch this thing here.
Yeah, and it does get sticky. Let me tell you, it does get sticky because once you start looking at our equipment and we start kind of peeling back the layers of the network, we're like, wait a minute, this isn't supposed to be happening, and this is how our switch operates. So, you know, we have to walk that fine line of, we know what our equipment can do, we know it's functioning, and, you know, the equipment that's interconnected, you know, the upstream links or other networking equipment that's interconnected, you know, when we see problems with that, that's when it gets a little hairy.
And maybe you've never seen this thing that they're connecting to it. They just bought it to put it in, and then they added other things on, and you don't even know what the heck that is. You've never seen one of these. You talked about it, crazy strawberry picker or something here, mechanical strawberry picker or something. And so suddenly you're trying to decide, is that the problem? Is some part of that machine not communicating correctly to the connecting device here, the Ethernet switch, the internet switch here?
Yeah, and so example, we'll take that strawberry picker, right? So we have.
I just think that's fascinating. This giant machine that rolls through fields, and carefully a robotic arm picks up the little leaves of the plant, and another one's a little camera circles around and says, that's looking just about right to pick, and then carefully picks this robotically in this giant machine. I think to me that's the example of where we're going with this thing. The robotics is headed here. But anyway, so there's a very sophisticated piece of equipment. Maybe something in there, maybe it's software, maybe it's mechanical, maybe it's a glitch of the connection or something here, but it's not connecting to what it's supposed to connect to. And the immediate thought is, well, it's the connector, it's the switch that's wrong.
Yeah, well, we'll use that as an example, right? So, you know, we have a connection to a camera and a robotic arm. Well, suddenly the robotic arm is kind of going a little slower, right? The camera's a little fuzzy. We're not getting the same kind of feed. So they might check a couple things, but then it's the switch. Well, yeah, it could be the switch, but there's also, you know, a bunch of other components in the way. So, you know, we can log in and check our switches, and hey, you know what? These ports are down, but it's supposed to be down when it sees an error. So what's the error? Well, we don't know. It was, you know, our stuff's working. It's got to be your side. Well, our stuff's working, you know, as we look at our indicators and we monitor our switches. Yeah. So, you know, and what makes it difficult is that we can't go on site, right? I can't send myself magically through a beam and like appear at these fields and start kind of looking at things and kind of poking and prodding to figure out what it is. So a lot of times we have to trust the customer that they know what they're talking about and that they can help us assist, because troubleshooting our stuff from a distance remotely, it's not ideal. You know, we can do it and we're pretty successful at it, but there's been some hairy moments with that.
And sometimes maybe it requires getting somebody on a plane and flying there if it's critical enough, if it's important enough, if you can't figure it out. You ever do that? You have to fly to the middle of nowhere to figure this thing out?
Yeah, actually, I have. So we had a really complicated configuration in Texas. We had some brilliant engineers out there, and they put this together, this really elaborate configuration for a network. And we did a lot of working together. And what ended up happening was we had set it up, and then some other engineer who wasn't the part of the original team, a new guy came in. He made some adjustments, broke the configuration, couldn't get it back to work again. And we had a lot of workshops, digital workshops. We spent hours and hours and weeks and weeks with this thing. And then I ended up flying out there to Texas. And, we looked at it, spent 2 days, took apart the whole thing, put everything back together again, only to figure out that this guy had double named everything. And when we double named everything, it caused problems.
Error.
Human error. But yeah, it was a lot of fun. Texas is a great state, really welcoming. They got great
happy
steaks
to go
out
back
there.
again, right?
Yeah, it was happy to go back
Good
anytime.
barbecue, right?
But yeah, it was just those little details, right? The smartest guy in the room, the new guy, can show us how to program our stuff because he knows what he's doing. Broke everything. So
how often does that happen? Probably more than we want to think. It's some really silly thing. Oh, this wasn't plugged in. It's got to go here instead of here. Oh, we gave everything two names by accident. Oh, it's just I forgot to flip this little switch, and now I get it. It all works. Is it that simple sometimes?
Sometimes it is. Sometimes it's the wrong address. Like, hey, we have addresses sometimes are real similar, and sometimes people mistake a 10 for an 11. Right, or
these are the internet addresses that things use to communicate with.
Yeah,
right?
The internet addresses, and they're wrong, and then we'll spend days trying to troubleshoot, and we're trusting them because they have our equipment, and they gave us a map, and we're following the map that you gave us.
Yeah.
We're following the documentation. Oh, you're not following your documentation.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So we actually ran into some things. We run into that quite often, more than I'd like to admit. But we
it's just this, things. And somebody kicks it or flicks it or touches it or points at something, and they go, oh.
Or plugged it into the wrong port.
Yeah, right.
We get that.
All right, so takeaways from today's session. You've seen it all. It sounds like there should be some sort of annual training event, some sort of emergency preparedness event, like you do for earthquakes, like you do for fires. What do you do to keep this critical connection, this critical internet up and running? Is that the first takeaway? Do something on a regular basis to review the documents, to train the people so everybody knows what to do when it doesn't work, and who to go to and where to start and who to pull into this. And
those are really the big takeaways that what I've seen in my experience. The most critical one and to me is documentation. We need documentation to know what we're dealing with, how things are connected. One thing that is people often overlook is a lot of times we have older pieces of equipment that can't be replaced.
Yeah.
Right. And then we don't have a manual, but we don't know how to fix it in case it breaks. Or they might have this old piece of equipment and they bought the last replacement unit. Well, we don't know how to connect it. So
and that company's long gone, or nobody knows. Old Joe knew how that worked, but old Joe's gone here.
Yeah. So we run into that from time to time. So that to me, that's important. Having the right people in the right places is also important. You got to train your staff. Don't expect people to know what you expect them to know, right? And unless you've trained them, don't assume they know everything, right? And unless you know that they've gone to the training courses and they've provided training, they had training provided to them, that they know what they're doing. Now, some of these guys are really brilliant guys. They're smart, high level people, but they might not know as much as you think they know. They might know portion A really great, but portion B failed. So we make sure that the proper people are trained. They know what to do in an emergency. And audits. Audits are huge. You got to know where your equipment's at, know where it's located at, how it's plugged in. I know.
It didn't get. I thought it was over here. It says it's over here. Why is it? Well, I forgot. We moved it behind that other piece because it was a problem. We needed that extra space.
Yeah. So those three, to me, those are the big three elements, right? Your documentation, getting the correct people change, audits, and then your emergency preparedness drills.
Yeah.
Those will save you time and money.
And what about thinking twice before? My dad always used to say, it's an old saying, measure twice, cut once. Before you deploy new stuff on top of old stuff, which is on top of old stuff on top of old stuff, maybe you think twice. Should you even virtually test this out? Because there must be unintended consequences when you stick new stuff into old stuff.
Yeah, there is, and sometimes it's you don't catch it right away, and sometimes that could lead to security gaps. What we've seen is that people they kind of mirror their network, but maybe on a smaller scale.
Mm-hmm.
So they'll on a lab or their experimental network, they'll do the same type of configuration, and then they'll add and bring in equipment that way, and then they can test it to make sure everything's functioning as normal. Then once they got the A-OK from the engineers or the people that need to check that off, then they implement the equipment or they get the processes in place.
And I'll ask you a tough question. I'll leave you one last tough one. You're a vendor for one little piece in this complicated puzzle, maybe one of the littlest pieces, one of the overlooked pieces, these network switches here, right? Do you ever just bite your tongue and say, oh my God, I see something developing? Or do you speak up and say, hey guys, I know you just brought me here to do this one little thing, but if you notice this, or have you ever thought about this? Do they ever ask you, or do you ever share into this? Or you're just, I'm just in here to do my thing. Good luck. I can see problems afoot here, but it's not my job.
No, I try to do my best, and I try to do my due diligence to let our customers know that,
You
make
see
them aware
something.
I do see something. And that's just because I figure with our company, Antaira, we try to provide the best service. So if I'm trying to fix our piece of equipment, but I've noticed that there's a couple things over here that should be looked at, I'll let them know. Just
Right.
because I'm here and I want to let them, make sure that they know that we're looking out for their best interests,
Right.
not just necessarily our piece. Now, with that being said, there's been some cases where people don't want you to touch anything. They
I'll
just
bet.
want you to look at that, and that's it.
Right.
You look at your piece. And so in those times, I'm like, oh, this is it. It works fine. And believe it or not, some people are good with that.
Yeah.
Some people are like, okay, your stuff checks. That's all we need you to do. We can take care of our stuff by ourselves. But as long as we know that your stuff's working fine, we can take it from here.
Well,
So-
that's the power of having good vendors, because they'll tell you what they see, and they'll try and give you some advice beyond just simply the task at hand here. And maybe, just maybe, they'll open your eyes to some other bigger issues and prevent that big collapse, that emergency, by catching something early on. Because you're there, a lot of vendors are, and I'll bet there's always a temptation to say, you thought about this? You might want to look at this. That documentation looks a little old. Maybe it needs to be updated or something here.
Yeah, we try to do our best with our customers, and we try to give them information just because, like I said, at the end of the day, we're partners and we need each other. They need
Yeah.
us, we need them. And if I can help look out for them to kind of avoid an emergency or avoid something, we'll do our best, or I'll do my best to make sure that I can help out.
Well, that's the advantage of working with companies like yours. Been doing it a long time, seen it all. Henry Martell, thanks for sharing some of the crazy things you've seen and some of the best practices, simple things really, to put in place to keep your operational network, that critical infrastructure, operating under emergencies, under changes of regimes, over time, as it adapts and adopts and new things get plugged into it. Just have some documentation, some policies, and some preparedness, right?
Yeah, it goes. It's a lot.
Goes a long way.
It goes a long way, and it's a lot more critical than you think.
I'll bet. Thanks for sharing your thoughts with us and your experience on this week's and Terry's podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Well, there you have it. If that's not a good reason to tune in each and every time, I don't know what it is. Some common sense ideas, some experiences from the front line, how to make a connection and keep it right here on the Antaira podcast.